Hey folks, and welcome back to the Inside the Mix podcast. And in this episode, I'm very excited to welcome our guest today. We've got a Grammy Award-winning multi-platinum producer and mix engineer of Dom Morley. Now, Dom is the founder of the Mix Consultancy, which we'll touch on a bit later in the podcast. And he's also a tutor at the music production at Leeds College of Music. Now, Dom has worked with artists such as Adele, Amy Winehouse, Jeff Beck, Mark Ronson, Underworld, and Sting, to name but a few. Sting really stood out to me because I've been on a bit of a Sting binge lately. So, fantastic stuff. Dom, thanks for joining me today, and how are you?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, it's Friday evening, so all is good. As we're recording this, sorry, I've broken something by saying it's Friday. This is not live, sorry.
No, not at all. To be fair, it probably would be quite good for me sometimes to give the audience a bit of an indication of when these things happen. But no, it is Friday evening, so we are in the UK. So I know that I do have, or rather the podcast does have quite an international audience, but it is Friday evening in the UK, and I don't know about where you are, but it is the classic UK weather of wet and windy down where I am in the southwest.
Yeah.
But there you go. That's what we've come to expect living in the UK. So, Dom, I thought what would be great is just to start, because we're going to move on to actual mix engineering a bit further down the line. It's just a bit of your story. How did you get to the stage where, or status where you are now, of being a mix engineer? Where did it all begin?
It began probably like most people. Like I was in a band as a teenager, and then wanted to record my band, so bought a few bits of recording gear, and this was back in the mid '90s, early '90s. So the cutting edge studio gear for a home studio was a Porter Studio, the cassette things, which bizarrely seem to be making a comeback. I have no idea why. I mean, weird. Anyway, so it was before computer audio, so I had one of those. And then bought an 8-track, bought a few mics, and just got, stuff like that. And really enjoyed that bit. I didn't really like I liked being in a band because it was with my mates. Didn't like performing, that didn't interest me. But I really liked recording and getting things to sound good. So that sort of led eventually to me looking for a job in the studio. And I went all around London with the killer line, I'll work for nothing and make good tea. Figuring I could probably sign on or something, I'd find a way. Got nowhere. 3 days of knocking on doors of studios, got nowhere. So then went to Birmingham, tried the same line, and somebody said, "Yeah, all right, see you Monday." So I started work experience at a place and did manage to sign on. So I got a little bit of whatever it was called, job sequence allowance or something back in those days. That got me through enough weeks to make a few contacts, and somebody who was the chief engineer of the studio, also in Birmingham, that was owned by the band UB40, was looking for a brand new assistant. So I got that gig based on recommendation from the people that I'd been kind of helping out for free at the place where I was doing work experience. So then I was there for a couple of years, and it was a good place. It was actually I'm still friends with people that I work with there. Really good little studio. It was 2 rooms, kind of a good out of London studio, because at the time, particularly in the 90s, it was incredibly London centric. And then after I think it's 2.5 years there, I moved down to London, and I did a bit of freelance assisting around, and then managed to get a job at Metropolis, which is a big studio in Chiswick, the biggest independent in Europe at the time, and probably still is, actually, to be fair. 5 studios, all sorts of different desks, all sorts of different bits of gear, mastering rooms, just everything. So that was the one I wanted, that gig. And it was actually because it might be an interesting sort of angle for your listeners, but the reason why I wanted Metropolis is because I'd worked at this studio we had in Birmingham. We had an SSL desk upstairs and something called an AMEC Angela downstairs. Now, what would happen occasionally is you get an engineer who'd been booked into the wrong room, and he was on the AMEC Angela, and he was expecting an SSL, and he basically couldn't work. And it happened a couple of times where it was like, if I haven't got an SSL, I can't do anything. And I didn't want to be tied to any one bit of gear ever, unless I could afford to buy it, and then I could take it with me. But so Metropolis at the time had 3 different SSLs, an E-Series, G-Series and J-Series, a Focusrite desk, which is very rare, and a Neve VR. So at that point, I thought if I trained there, I'd just know how to use desks. and then I could walk into any studio and be perfectly happy with whatever's in front of me, because I just know how to use gear, rather than being tied to any specific bit of equipment. So that's kind of a principle I've always held really ever since, that I've always got a reasonable amount of gear myself anyway, and that's great, but I can sort of go anywhere. I might take a couple of bits with me, but that'd be it. I'd be happy wherever I work. So that was that idea. And then so I was there for a bit, working up from the very bottom, newest assistant gets all the 24-hour sessions, all that sort of stuff. After about 7 years there, I was in-house engineer, went freelance. I was getting enough sort of work to go freelance. And then, I've been freelance for 12 years, something like that. Had a little studio in Metropolis for a while. I shared it with a friend of mine called Chris Potter. The two of us just rented a room at Metropolis. But then I moved out of London to where I am now. About 7 years ago, got this studio in this building in Oxfordshire, which I turned into a studio. And so, I've been here ever since. That's the potted history of quarter of a century of me working. There you go.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's kind of like that classic story of like the I don't want to say the tea runner, but I guess it is in a way. You sort of like you start at the bottom there, and I love the idea of the variety being the key to success. And I think it's a great mentality to have in probably most creative aspects, is having a bit of variety, so you'd be able to take yourself into other studios and other situations. Yeah,
do you think carry on working? Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, do you think because the way you sort of entered the industry, does that sort of avenue still exist? Is it still possible to do that if you wanted to get experience in a studio?
It does, but the opportunities are far fewer than they were in the 90s. It's kind of flipped, because back then there were hardly any courses that you could do on engineering. You couldn't really. There were. As far as I knew, there was SAE, Alchemy, Tonmeister, and I think one other were all the ones that I knew that did like music production or sound engineering. And so it's hard to get on those courses because there were so few. So you'd get a job in a studio. And I actually my plan was initially, if I didn't have a job after 4 months, I'd probably have run out of all my money. And they sort of started to get a bit edgy about you signing on for too long. So then I'd try and go start a course and try and start full-time education. So that was the sort of way it was around there. You try and get a job in a studio. If you couldn't, you'd maybe go into education, and then you'd meet some people that way and then start working. So this now it's sort of flipped in that there are a lot of courses and a lot of good courses. And I'm actually at Leeds Conservatoire, by the way. It's not Leeds College of Music. It used to be called Leeds College of Music. But
I see.
So I'll let you off. It's changed. It's Leeds Conservatoire. So now there's loads of those, and there's not many studios. So actually, I think the route these days is more to study, and this is the crucial bit, is to meet people there and start working, because that's really what you want to do wherever you are, whether you're working in a studio or you're working or you're at college. The point is you learn on the job or on the course, and you meet people and you start working, and that's how you get a career. And so that's what I did. Fortunately, the difference being, fortunately, if you get a job in the studio, you're paid to do that. Whereas if you're obviously doing a course, you have to pay to do that. But the principle is the same: is that you are there to learn how to do it and to network in order to meet people and start working.
Yeah, so with the courses at the Leeds Conservatoire, which my due diligence there let me down in the run-up to the podcast interview, with that there, and with your students, are you actively telling them, sort of from day dot, like you're here to study, but also at the same time you should be out there networking and you should be out there meeting artists and 100%. Recording, performing, whichever avenue they want to go down from day dot?
Yeah. So I actually teach the masters. I'm a tutor for the masters in music production. So it's only a year course, like a full 12-month one. And in the first or second session, I'll start the conversation with, right, so in a year's time, what are you going to do to make money out of what you've learnt this year? And then keep having that conversation again and again and again to push them to make plans, to have things that they start. Because the other thing is, everything always takes a long time to actually, between having the idea or being asked to do a job and getting paid. The idea is that I want them to start getting the ball rolling on that, and having things that they've got in the pipe work and ideas they're starting to put into place, so that when they leave, they can focus on it more. But also, money's starting to come in already. So yeah, I definitely say that.
Fantastic. It kind of segues nicely into the next part then, which is kind of we've got the educational side of things and building that experience. So what I'd like to move on to now really is the actual the mixing side of things. So this podcast episode in particular is going to sort of centre around that cool. Mix engineering, specifically for those who are learning, and obviously there are going to be bits and pieces in there for the experts and the intermediates as well. So I mean, the first question really I think is quite a good one, and it kind of links to I listened to the the Production Expert podcast that you did yourself with Mike Exeter as well. Which is a fantastic.
He's the guy that gave me my first job.
Yeah.
Mike Exeter was working at UB40 Studio. Yeah, well, he was working at UB40 Studio. He was the chief engineer there. So when I got that first job out of work experience, it was him that gave it to me.
How amazing! And he's worked with some big bands, Sabbath, Priest, being a metalhead. That immediately, I was like, okay.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, that was the first
straight
session
on my radar.
I did there. The very first session was Tony Iommi recording some demos with Glenn Hughes singing and Don Airy on keys, and wow. Mike engineered it as the in-house engineer. And basically, Mike's worked with Tony Iommi since then. He's been his engineer since then. That came out as the
Has he really?
Sessions.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's quite nice. Yeah.
That's one hell of a session for your first session to sit on.
It really was. Yeah, it was quite mad. Yeah,
that is. Yeah, I would struggle not to be in awe of just watching him play guitar and not taking everything else around in with regards to the engineering and everything else that's going on.
It was quite
fantastic.
Surreal. But also fair play to Mike for a brand new kid on a session that was pretty important, you know. But yeah, he did. So I was obviously a lucky charm, though.
100%.
Yeah.
So yeah, this kind of leads off from that episode in particular of the Production Expert podcast. So it's kind of like the question being is if you could tell our audience a bit about the difference between sort of a radio-friendly sort of professional mix and a novice mix. Now, you run the mix consultancy, which we'll touch on in a bit. But when you receive those mixes in, because I'm assuming they're various degrees of quality, what generally separates that sort of entry-level mix to that professional mix?
There's two things I think that are key, really, which take a while to learn. And one of them I think people know and the other one people don't. And the one that I think people know is about EQing things. So they sit together and there's space in the mix and there's clarity around the different instruments that are there. And that allows the dynamic of the track to come through as well. So it not only helps the individual sounds, but also allows the dynamic of the song to come through. Because once you've got instruments sitting together nicely, you can start pushing them up and down and doing what you want with them because they're not fighting with each other for a certain amount of space. And that's the big thing I think I find a lot with people at Mix Consultancy that I help them with is to hear that clash where those problems are happening, because that's I think the thing that takes so long to learn when you're just sat there on your own learning how to mix. And the reason why I came up with the idea with the Mix Consultancy, in fact, was after one particularly revelatory experience that I had where I was an assistant on a session. There was a very big band. I don't think I'm allowed to say who it was, but it was a very big band with decades worth of recordings. And we were going through everything and digitizing it because it was all on tape, just putting it into Pro Tools and going and a rough mix of each one, because it was a band that sort of did a lot of jamming as well as writing. So there were a lot of jams that might turn into songs. They just wanted to know what they had recorded, that in case there was anything useful that they wanted to revisit for the next record. So there were 3 rooms running, 3 engineers, 3 assistants, of which I was one, and one guy who was overseeing the whole thing, who was also a mix engineer too, who I'd worked with loads. I knew him well. So what happened was the engineer that I was working with was ill for a couple of days. So Chris, who was producing it, said to me, "Look, Dom, can you just step in and do what we've been doing for a couple of days and, load them into Pro Tools, do a quick rough mix, and when every rough mix, just give me a call and I'll come down and just spend 20 minutes, just finishing it off," which for me was just a golden opportunity to do it as good as I could do it, and then have somebody with 20 years of experience sit down and go, right, here's what I'm going to change from here. So then I was looking over his shoulder going, okay, he's changed that. Well, that sounds so much better from that little tweak. I didn't realise there was a problem there, but now he's changed it. I can hear it. So it was a huge thing for me. In a couple of days, I learned so much just from leaning over him and hearing what he had heard and how he changed it. So that's what the idea with the mix consultancy is that people can send stuff in to me. And I've been doing this for 25 years, so I've probably got a bit of experience on quite a lot of people. And I can just go, right, well, these are the changes that I would do if I was sat in front of this mix now. I can hear problems at 300 hertz in the guitar or 80 hertz in the kick drum and recommend a change, which will normally be generally about the ballpark of where it ends up being apparently from the feedback I get from people that use it. But the important thing is what I find really inspiring about doing it, because I'll do that and, I'll send someone a PDF of here's what I changed, here's all the things I changed with this track. And it's a lot of it is EQ stuff, just to clear everything out, make it all sound great. But then what's great is people use it again and again and again. They use the service. I get quite a lot of people that once they've used it once, realise that it's helping them a lot. And they get much better very quickly. Yeah. Because they can hear it then. They hear that problem that I spotted and they go, oh, yeah. So then that doesn't happen the next time. So it's a really interesting process, that getting the repeat business from people and realising how quickly they're learning how to get better at mixing. The other thing that people don't realise, I think, is how important automation and balance is to moving a mix from being good to being great. And I think the tale I always tell my students is I watched an interview with Andy Wallace, who I think is an incredible mix engineer, does a lot of rock stuff. And he said he spends about 45 minutes doing all the EQ, compression, effects, balance, and he's got probably 3 assistants that do most of this, setting up a mix for him. But 45 minutes to get a mix together is not a lot of time. That's extremely quick. Yeah. He's been doing it for like twice as long as I have, so he should be fast, but even so. Yeah. But then he said he spends 10 hours on a mix. So the rest of the time he's doing these little automation moves and moving things around so that everything hits at exactly the right time. And really you're drawing the point of what you're doing there, the job of the mixer, is to draw the listener's attention to the right thing at every beat of the mix. So the listener's always hearing the vocal or that little grace note on the snare or the fill on the bass or the delay you set off on the guitar that was a cool little sound to fill that gap. And pushing the listener's interest around that is all about automation. And it's an odd task because you set up a nice balance and everything's sounding good, and then you start getting into the automation and it sort of falls apart a bit while you're doing stuff on the drums or stuff on the guitars or vocals, and your balance falls apart. So it always sounds worse before it sounds better. But then at the end, when you've actually got it nailed, having done some good EQ work before, compression and effects are working, all of that stuff, getting the automation work so the dynamics of the song are being served properly is the difference between a good and a great mix.
Fantastic. So you've got 2 things there, haven't you? So sort of like the EQ and the clarity, as you mentioned there, and the automation. What about compression? Because compression, having spoken to and been involved with a lot of the listeners, and compression is something that comes up a lot. What pitfalls might be the wrong word, but what challenges do you see in a novice mix with regards to compression?
The first one is being able to hear what it's doing, because I know I couldn't. When I started out, I had no idea. When I first started in the studio, people were putting compression on and talking about compression, and I was like nodding and grinning and going, yeah, thinking, I can't hear the difference. I don't know what they're talking about. And then finally I got to go in the studio on my own, because obviously this is pre-DAWs. I didn't get a chance to do anything on my own and play with it. So then I sort of put something through a compressor and slammed it. I went, oh, okay, well, that's doing it wrong because that's too much. But then if I peel it back, then I can notice how it sort of starts to make things pump a little bit, and then you put a couple of things together and they start pumping together, and I can see how this is a good thing. I understand it a bit better now. So that's challenge 1, is actually hearing what it's doing without doing it too much, without sort of absolutely slamming everything. But then I think the other thing that people get confused by a lot is settings like attack and release. Not all compressors have those on, obviously, but if you do, I always say, like with release, set it to release in time with the music. That's your best safe option. So watch the needle go back in time with the music, and then you're pulling everything to be moving in time. So you're helping the groove of the song by doing that. And then with the attack time, start slow so it's not really doing anything, and then go faster and faster on the attack time until it starts to grab the thing that you are trying to compress, and then leave it when it sounds good is the bottom line. So that's attack and releases. That's what I would sort of recommend as when you're learning and start doing that. And the other thing I think is, again, this sort of reaches into the automation. Don't use compressors to level out your mix. Use automation to do that. Use compressors to make things grabby and punchy and exciting, because that's what they're really good at. At leveling things out, they're okay. That was all we had back in like the 70s and 60s and 50s. We only had compressors. We didn't have automation. So you had to use it to sort of squash things. Whereas these days, that's better done with automation. And with compressors, you can use them for what they're really good at nowadays, which is making things punchy and exciting.
Yeah, I really like the idea of what you said about the attack and release, because I remember when I was starting out, and admittedly I haven't been in the industry, the game as long as yourself, but I would struggle with the attack and release and in terms of what to do. And then very much like you've said right there, is I found it was either a tutorial or an article. In fact, it might have been Bobby Ozinski. It might have been in the Bobby Ozinski Mix Engineers Manual or Engineer Manual. And he said, and it said exactly what you said there about the slow attack. And then the releasing time with the music.
Fantastic! So it's not just me that thinks that's a good idea. Then that's good.
No, I've been doing it ever since, and it works wonders. And it's a fantastic one. Going back to the EQ, with regards to EQ, if you're just starting out, can you think of any sort of exercises, like ear training exercises or anything along those lines, to help with regards to what EQ is doing and how to balance those frequencies?
I don't know about ear training exercises. What I try and tell people is put a thing in the mix, whatever it might be. Start with one thing and then add another thing, and see if you can hear a problem where it's not as clear as it was before. It doesn't sound as good as it was before, and where is that? Because there's normally somewhere, unless you've got a kick and a hi-hat, that are so far apart it doesn't matter. But say put two guitars or a guitar and a piano or a couple of synths together or stuff, and go, okay, where is the problem? Where does it sound muddy and confused and busy? Where it's not separated? And what you've got there is an area where they both have a presence, and they both are have a reasonable volume in that frequency, but they're not both allowed it because it sounds worse. So you've got to make a call on who gets to win at that point. And so then just boost. I still do this all the time. Boost and sweep around. So boost up 3 or 4 dB or whatever you want to do. Sweep that around till you hear the point where you go, that frequency, that's the one that I don't like. And then take that out of one or the other, and see who sounds better without it. So it might be you take it out of the guitar, and it's like, well, now the guitar's lost what we need from the guitar by taking that frequency out. Therefore, it's got to go from the synth or the piano because you can't lose the main sort of focus of the guitar by doing this. So, like for a good example, I do it with the vocal when I start a mix, is I'll find like a present frequency of the vocal, normally sort of between 2 and 3K, which is sort of the peak sensitivity of human hearing, because that's where voices, are most present. So I find a spot there by doing a boost and a sweep, and there's normally a point where it feels like the singer's just stepped forward a foot, that it's just a little bit more present when I boost that frequency and go, okay, that's their spot, nothing else is allowed there. So in everything from there, then I make a note of the frequency, and then for the rest of the mix, everything else has to have a dip there because the vocal has to be there. There's nothing that can fight with the vocal. So I don't care who you are. You might be a snare drum, you might be a great guitar sound. You ain't going in that frequency because the vocal's got it. Yeah,
that's a fantastic tip, because I think with vocals in particular, now the podcast itself is sort of centered, and it focuses on like the synth side of things and synth music, which is why I was for the audience. If you're watching this podcast, you'll see there's an array of modular synths in the background there in Dom's studio, which is incredibly impressive. But yeah, and I do get the question a lot of vocal, and in terms of bringing vocal, because a lot of synthwave tracks and synth music, I say a lot, a vast majority of it is instrumental, and bringing those vocals in. And that's a really cool way of doing it. And I like the idea of just saying and being rigid and strict and saying nothing else is going to go in that spot that I've picked out with that EQ sweep, which is amazing. Actually,
it's quite often I see things on forums. I really shouldn't go on forums, but occasionally I go on forums and I see people saying, how do I get, why isn't my vocal fitting in this track? And then somebody will suggest like a 10 plug-in chain. I'm just like, oh God. It's just like the guitars are in the same spot as the vocals. There's nothing you can do to that vocal to make it fit. You do it to the guitars and make some space for it, and then it'll be fine. And easy moving the guitars and everything's done. So that sort of thing is, it's once you, and again, it's sort of thing with the mix consultancy. Once you've done it a few times, it's obvious. You hear it straight away because you're used to listening for it and finding it.
Yeah, it's interesting that with regards to the plug-in chains, because scrolling through the internet, scrolling through social media, and I see various posts every now and again. I see quite a lot, and it's just plug-in chain after plug-in chain after plug-in chain, which is great. But a lot of the time, as you say there, it's not necessarily the plug-in chain that or your plugins or whatever it is you're using that's the issue. It's that frequency bounce. So. There's another question I wanted off the back of this, but before we go on to that, my next question was going to be, you mentioned there about the vocals. So when you're actually starting a mix session, which instrument group are you starting with, or does it vary depending on the project?
Well, I do that thing with the vocal, and then I do the drums. That's always my route. So I know where the hole's got to be for the vocal, and then, because the drums the kick defines the bottom end, the snare defines the mid-range, and the hi-hats and cymbals define the top. So once you've got those in place, then you can start fitting the instruments in. But I would hate to have to fit drums in after the fact, because they are everywhere. So I'd hate to have to try and fit that in after I'd got in all the rest of the instrumentation. That would be a pain. So that's always the route I go.
Yeah, it's a similar route that I follow myself, and in other discussions I've heard other engineers do that as well with regards to the drums. Admittedly, I don't think I've ever started a mix with the vocals first, but certainly something I'm going to try going forward now, because it's being a sort of engineer, a producer myself, and quite new to the game, as it were, comparative to yourself. It's still learning that, and I find the vocal chain is probably don't want to use that term, but the vocals being the hardest bit of the mix to get right, and I think actually maybe doing it first is the way to go.
And then make space for it. Yeah, make sure every time you bring an element in, it's not fighting with the vocal, because it's not allowed to.
Yeah, and vocals, I think also, what I've noticed, yeah, exactly, and what I've noticed in mixes that I've done myself is that when I've left the vocal to the end, and I've got all this other stuff going on, and I'm just like, shit, where does that vocal go now? And I've had it so many times. I don't know why. I'm like, and then I go through track by track, and I'm like, right, I'm going to have to get rid of that. I'm going to have to get rid of that. I'm going to have to get rid of that. Get rid of that. And then I'm like, I'm just going to have to write the song, produce and compose the song all over again. Yeah. So audience listening, vocals first. Go with the vocals first.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't really go to town with it. I don't go to town with it. I know some people who do the whole vocal sound first and then carry on. I just find out the main present frequency in that mid-range and go, okay, I know it's got to be there. And then I move on. So there'll be more that I do afterwards, but I just need to know that bit.
So it's actually just picking out the sort of frequency, that pivotal frequency, and then the actual rest of the processing will be done further down the line. Yeah.
But there are other people that do it the other way. I know people that start with the vocal sound, particularly, I think, more often than not, people who work in real pop stuff. I've known people do that, where they get the whole vocal sound, effects, compression, the works, and then start bringing other things in. That's fine.
That's an interesting way of doing it. Because if you were to start with them, with all that to begin with, and then you bring other instrumentation in, would you not need to then go back and adjust? Well, I suppose you're going to do it anyway, and adjust that vocal processing that you've done.
You do it anyway. When you're doing a mix, it's not like you set up your bass sound and then that's done. I'll never touch that again. You're always tweaking stuff and going back in and.
Yeah. Interesting. Kind of segues nicely then onto the next part, which is, imagine we've gone through all this process then, and we've gone through the mix, we're relatively happy. How do you know when the mix is finished and ready to put to bed? Now, this is something that I struggle with personally a lot, and I go through I can go through binge editing, and I can be sat there and just binging and doing it needlessly. And, I slap myself on the wrist for doing it. But
I have a set process for this. Which actually I thought loads of people did, and then I do like a monthly chat with a couple of other guys who I trained with back in Metropolis, and sort of because we used to do this sitting around the coffee machine, and we don't do that because we're all in our own little studios. So I do a monthly Zoom with those guys, and I brought it up, my process, and I thought everyone did it, and they hadn't heard of this. So here what I do is, so I have two sets of speakers. I have some Neumanns and some Yamaha NS10s, and then I have two sets of headphones that I use for mixing as well. I have some Grados, and then these things called Rossen Audio ones, which are very nice posh ones. And what I do is I pick one of those things for my first pass. So I've got the sound, everything's kind of together, but I need to get into automation now to get the thing finished. So I pick one of those things and go from start to finish, doing everything that I can hear, everything that I think needs doing. So maybe say it's on the Neumanns, do everything so it sounds finished to me on the Neumanns. Then I go on to another one, probably I'll go into the Grados, do the same from start to finish. Then I go into the NS10s, same thing. Then I go into the Rossens, same thing there, and then back to the Neumanns for last pass. And at that point, I probably can't hear anything I want to change. And once I've done the last pass on the thing that I started on, I'm done.
So you're sort of trialing it on different systems or different listening environments, headphones, and then...
So I'm kind of doing the mix, going through, doing all my automation moves, everything that I want to do, and then I'm jumping on a different set of monitors and doing the same thing. Where there's always less, there's less for each round. There's far less for you to do, but it just means I know I'm not missing anything because I'm checking out on all my different systems and making the changes that I hear on there. And then, I have got these different ones because they all do sound a little bit. I like the sound of them all, but they are all a bit different. So, that's how it works.
With regards to different listening environments, I sort of audition mixes and productions in the car, and I hear conflicting stories with that. I hear, I read, some individuals will say, no, you shouldn't do that, and others will say, well, yes, you should. What are your opinions on auditioning sort of in a car environment?
You should do it if it works. If you can sit in the car and you hear your mix and you hear something that's not right about it, and then you go and change that thing that you heard and it sounds better, then that's a great listening environment for you. And it's just like, with these headphones, these speakers, they won't work for some people, but they work for me, so it's great. The car thing didn't work very well for me, so I stopped doing it. It might just been I didn't like the stereos, particularly in the cars that I had. I've got a new car now with a nice stereo, so maybe I'll start doing it, but I can't be bothered. What I've got at the moment works, so let's not mess with that too much. But no, I think any of those kind of rules that people set is like, I find a bit weird. Like when people say you can't mix on headphones, well, you can. And if your mixes sound really good on headphones, then keep doing it. So, and there's very slight technical things that people say about it. But this tiny technical thing. It's like, but people, if you know that, and you know your headphones well, you work around that, and you know that that's the case. It's like, there's people that, suffer from minor levels of hearing loss that are mix engineers, and they work around it, their perception deals with it, and they turn out brilliant mixes. And I was speaking to a mastering engineer recently who said it always used to be the case back in like the 80s, up to the end of the 80s, that people would come into mastering and go, I've got a bit of a hole in my hearing, about 500 hertz, so there might be something odd there, but there you go. And then they carry on. It'd be a brilliant mix, and there'd be something a bit odd about that. So all those things, those little limitations that everybody has, either in themselves or in their room or in their whatever, as long as you know what they are, you can carry on and get a great job.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've spoken to numerous producers, and I know a few off the top of my head, and who mix predominantly with headphones, and their mixes sound great, and the productions sound great. I did know. This was way back when I was studying music production, and there was a lad, and he was mixing using Apple in-ear headphones.
Wow!
And I know, and his production sounded amazing, and he'd obviously attuned them and he'd done it so much, and he was so attuned to using them and how they translated. He got it totally dialed in, which was incredibly impressive. Yeah. So it kind of leads on to the next bit then, with regards to misconceptions and myths. So with regards to mix engineering, what do you think is the biggest sort of misconception or myth that maybe someone who's starting out would read or hear?
Good point. I think probably any of those aforementioned rules, I think, are misconceptions and myths. The idea that you can't do something. And I always try and remember that when I'm telling people how I do stuff or how I'd recommend to do stuff. And yeah, unless you don't agree with that, or unless you think that sounds rubbish, in which case don't do it. And I do that in the mixed consultancy stuff as well. I try and flag up, like, this comment is slightly in the realms of production rather than mixing. Like, it's like, this is a taste comment, so try it, see if you like it. If you don't, sack it off, it doesn't matter. But it's just, I always try and approach it of like, what would I do if I was sat here? Here's what I would do, right? So that's I try and check myself on that sort of thing. But yeah, I think if you ever hear anyone sort of saying, oh, you can't monitor on those, you can't listen on that, you shouldn't do this, that plugin's not for that, it's for this, you can't mix with plugins, it's got to be analog, it's got to be digital, etc., etc., etc. All of that's nonsense. All that matters is what comes out the speakers. Does it sound good? If it does, you've nailed it.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's a case of like the end listener's not going to really care too much about the process of putting it together.
Not even a tiny bit. Not a tiny bit.
Yeah, exactly. No. Exactly that. And it leads on again to this next question, and it kind of falls under, maybe it does fall under the myths and misconceptions. And this regards to sort of mixing and then mastering, because a lot of the audience do mix and master. They write, produce, mix, master their own music. Yeah. What is your opinion on mixing and mastering your own music? Should you get maybe someone else to master it? Is it? Yeah, basically that is the question. Do you think it's worthwhile getting a second set of ears to master that music if it is possible and it falls within your sort of budget?
Yes, always. Yes, I would always do that if I could. And I think I've once or twice mastered something that I've mixed myself. But I feel it's a bit like marking your own homework if you do that. Whereas if I send it to someone else, then I'm getting a second set of professional ears, listen to the mix in a different room, which is also good, on different speakers or my lot, and getting their kind of take on it. So yeah, I would always recommend to do that. I know it is a budgetary thing, but I think that the problem that I think has sort of crept into music production is it seems that people think it's the norm to mix and master something, like it's all one process and it's one person's job, and it isn't. And I don't think it should be. I understand that sometimes that's how things go, just like sometimes you're better off as a performer, somebody else doing the engineering for you. So all you have to think about is the performance. You don't have to think about how things are routed and all that sort of stuff. You can focus on the one job that you've got, which is performing. And if you've got an engineer, they can do their bit and you get a better result on both ends. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you've got to do it yourself, do all the jobs yourself. Same with mixing and mastering. Sometimes you just have to do it and that's how life is. But if you get an opportunity to get someone else to cast their ears over it and go, this is perhaps a little bit heavy here, I think you can push it this much on the compression, blah, 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 then I would always do that. The one sort of thing that I think people need to be aware of with using other mastering engineers, using other people to do it, is be aware of how you want your track to sound and let them know if they didn't do that. Because I have had mixed experiences with mastering engineers, and the ones I use now are ones I've used, I found a few guys that I use a lot. And they sit there and listen to the mix and go, okay, that's what he's aiming for. And then they just make that better. And occasionally in the past, I've had people go, right, he's probably got that wrong then. I'm going to change this completely. And I'm like, well, that's not what we wanted. Because my mix got the okay from the band. Everyone was happy. Yeah. And so now you're supposed to just make that a bit better with the mastering job. Hear any problems, whatever, but not completely change it. So that's just the only bit of advice I say I'd give if you're sort of new to farming mastering out to other people is be aware that this is if the mix is signed off and okay, everyone likes it. That's what everyone wants, and it just needs to be a slightly embellished version of that, not something completely different.
Yeah, fantastic advice. And do you think it's worth with mastering finding a mastering engineer who specialises in specialise might be the wrong word, but their wheelhouse is the genre of music that you're working within? Because I guess mastering engineers, though, they're quite broad, aren't they, in terms of what they master?
Yeah, I mean, I know that often happens. It happens in all areas of the industry, really. There's people get known for doing certain things, and it's mostly because you've done those things a bit, and people recognise you for it and go, oh, well, he did that record, that sounds a bit like mine, so he can have mine now. And then you just end up down a sort of, a bit of a path. It's something I've tried to avoid, if at all possible, because I think it keeps life more interesting if you're doing like a variety of things.
Yeah.
But then you sort of end up doing a better job on things that you understand more, I think. So that kind of does make a bit of sense. Like I don't do a lot, or I don't do any hip hop. I don't do any kind of black metal. Those are things I don't listen to. So it's not stuff that I would do a good job on, I don't think. So, and unfortunately I don't get offered it, so I don't have to say no to anybody, because they've also not seen any of that on my CV. So it's fine. It all works out okay. But yeah, I would, there's no harm in looking about in the CV, and if none of it's what you are into or want to sound like, then maybe find somebody where the CV does look like something you want to sound like, because that's what they're working on every day, if it's a certain sort of thing. So there's no harm in it. I don't think it's vital, but I think it might make things a little smoother. Yeah,
so I suppose the key bit of information or advice there would be is, obviously, I think if you're going to choose a mastering engineer, is to go check out their CV, their portfolio of music that they've done, and see if it sort of resonates with the music that you have. Yeah. And then you'd be able to make a sort of an informed decision from that.
Yeah, and they'll probably understand what you're aiming for, because that's the sort of stuff they work on every day. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Dom, I'm well aware we're all 40 minutes in already, and what we're going to move on to now. So the Inside the Mix podcast has a Facebook community group, and in there, when I'm doing an interview, I will post and say, if you've got questions you'd like me to put toward the interviewee, do post them. So I've got 3 questions here. So the first one is from Maurice, aka Kumo Wee. And he asks, is it different to mix for vinyl? And if you do, well, he's actually got 2 questions. So that's the first one. Is it different if you're mixing for vinyl?
No, that's a mastering process. Mixing would be exactly the same, and mastering and I'm, as a not mastering engineer, I'm going to explain this really badly, and mastering engineers, if they're hearing this, are going to be shouting, but. The way I understand it is, in order to get it onto the vinyl, you have to do certain things about monoing the bass and being careful how much bass you put on it, because that can cause the needle to jump if there's too much, because the cut's too deep, and things like that. So there's a technical process that means you have to master it slightly differently. So if you are mastering a record, an album, you might master it separately for a digital upload than you would for vinyl, because there's different considerations.
Fantastic, thanks for that. Then, so basically, the mix is essentially the same, and then it falls into the realm of mastering. Then for the vinyl.
Yeah, the only thing, actually, one thing is, if you had a super stereo bass, I think that wouldn't get on vinyl, and they'd have to do something about that. So you might want to think about that when you mix it. I think that's the only consideration I would do, is if I had like a really big stereo bass sound. I think might not fit on vinyl. That so, yeah.
Fantastic. So the next question from Maurice is, I think this ties in quite well actually to the Loop Masters, the Stranger Synths. Talking about Stranger Synths, Loop Master project that you went with. So his next question is, what was your approach for sync projects in TV? Now he was a bit vague with that one. Now I'm assuming he means with regards to the production. How does that sort of start?
Yeah, so the only thing that I've done like that is those sample packs. I don't work on like production albums or sync stuff, so I haven't got an angle on that. The only thing the story behind that one was simply that I had a load of friends text me and email me and said, "Have you seen this thing, Stranger Things series? You'd love the soundtrack. It sounds just like the sort of music you make." So then I checked it out and thought, "Oh yeah, it does." I could probably do a sample pack of stuff that sounds a bit like that, and people might be into it. So that's how that came about. Opportunistic.
Oh, I see. Yeah, fantastic. So do you do a lot of the total tangent here? Do you do a lot of sort of your own synth productions? Because obviously with the modular synths you've got in the background there, with time permitting, I guess. Do you release
the big phrase, time permitting, which it isn't. So I did a 4-track EP. Under the name 5 Pages, which is 5 as a V, like the Roman numeral thing. So if you look up V Pages on your streaming platform of choice, there's a 4-track EP there, which is a bit synthy. First track's a bit more guitar. There's a few guitars on it, but it's mostly synthy stuff and some friends singing. that's all I've actually put out myself. This ends up on other people's records, basically. Either
cool.
as, if I'm mixing, I might put stuff through it, or recommend they send a MIDI file with the synth part, and I can embellish or replace or something, or just if I'm producing something, this will end up on there somewhere.
Fantastic, excellent stuff. I'll go and check that out. 5 pages on my streaming platform of choice. Brilliant stuff. In fact, what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes for this episode,
cool.
So the audience can go away and have a listen to that as well. So the next question is from Chaco Daniel. So he's a producer called Tholos. Asks, how do you dial in modern retro sounds during mixing? And he cites the Amy Winehouse Back to Black album. That's quite a broad question there.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that was mixed by Tom Elmhurst, not me. I recorded most of that, but he mixed it. But I can certainly tell you how we recorded it to sound modern retro, which was had a conversation with Mark Ronson, who produced half the album. Sal and Romy did the other half, but probably if you only know the singles, you know all Mark's ones. And he said about wanting to sound old 60s girl group, Phil Spector, those kind of sounds, because I was doing first session I did with him was strings, a string session, and I think actually we had brass and orchestral percussion on in one day. It was like quite a big kind of full-on shipping things in and out of the recording room. So I set up a lot of valve mics and a lot of ribbon mics, because those were the mics that they had in those days. That was the process that they had. So I thought, well, let's try and be as authentic as we can by using the gear that they had. But then also what I sort of thought as well, I'd read, books about those sort of things. There's a really good biography of Phil Spector, which is really interesting. But what they would do in those days often is they would have one mic in the room. They didn't have the capability to mic everything up individually. So it'd be just one mic or a few mics that would cover the room, and then you move the instruments closer or further away, depending on how loud you want them to be. So I thought, as an aside, I'd put a ribbon mic in the studio that we were recording in. Had like a big, there's a bit of glass and concrete, plaster, unfortunately, but there was some wooden bits, and there was like a shell-shaped wooden thing covering a corner, like the inside of a shell. So I put a ribbon mic up there to catch some room sound with an old mic, that sort of thing. And then speaking to Tom afterwards, when he was mixing it, or after he'd mixed it, that mic was what he used for most of the string sound, and then he just fed things into it from there. So that was a way of getting those to sound old, was simply by using the techniques that they used, and the equipment that they used. And there you go. That's how they did it. So that's how we'll do it. So in terms of mixing, there's a few things you can do that are little tricks. Like, for example, if you set up the same room reverb or small hall, that's kind of, and everything goes to that a little bit. That's how they were recorded in those days, because everything was in the same room. There was, like, Phil Spector used a room called Gold Star where he did everything. And so that can start to sound a little bit retro by the fact that it all sounds like it's in the same space. And not going too bright on things, because things weren't recorded that bright. So concentrate more on warm and mellow is another one.
Fantastic. It's interesting that you mentioned Phil Spector there, because what's the date today? It's the 11th of November. I've challenged myself with, I don't know why I've done this, with writing a Christmas song or covering a Christmas song. And I've been listening to Phil Spector's Christmas album.
The finest Christmas album there is.
It's very good. What I was doing is I've been on a music sort of theory and composition and arrangement binge of late, and I was thinking, right, how are these songs put together? So I've been looking around online and then listening to songs and thinking, okay, this goes there, that goes there. What chords are they using? Chord progressions and all that sort of things. And it's really interesting, actually, which is why it's led me down this Phil Spector route. But it's exactly what you mentioned there about the particular sound you have, because when you listen to it, it sounds like one microphone, but I guess it wouldn't sound the same if it was recorded. No, it wouldn't have that character.
It's that wall of sound thing, which is cool. Interestingly, I did work with Phil Spector once, just as an assistant, and I got him to sign my copy of the Christmas album, which I was very pleased about.
Oh wow!
But he said it was a good story. He said it took about 9 months putting that album together, with the writing and the recording and everything. It was a big project for him, because it was on his label, and it was like, I'm going to be rich because I'm going to make the best Christmas album ever. And he said, and then just before Christmas, Kennedy was shot. and Christmas was cancelled in America. So then did nothing because nobody was they weren't going for it the way they had. And it took him years to recoup what he'd spent on it. But then obviously since then it's been massive. But yeah, it was quite funny that totally went very badly for quite a while. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite the anecdote. That's not great when that happens. Well, I say when that happens, like it's happened a lot. But yeah, that is incredibly unfortunate. But like you said, I think he's probably done quite well off the back of it. I think I want to say it was re-released. I could be wrong. This once again, this was late last night when I was researching the foundations of a Christmas song. So the final question is from another community member called Dan Maloney, and his question is: when so much is possible inside the box, is investing in really pricey mic preamps worthwhile, or would a good microphone and decent plug-in be better? I suppose a good example of that would be like there's the Slate Digital mic emulation, which you buy the Slate Digital mic and then you have various different mic modelings within their software.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not particularly the best guy to answer that on the basis that I haven't used any of those. I haven't used the modelling mics. I've heard good things. There was the Townsend one as well, which won an award for best mic, not even best modelling mic, just as a great sounding mic, which then got bought by Universal Audio, the company. So I think that's turned into Universal Audio's mic. Or if they've got one out, it's that one, or whatever.
Yeah.
If not, one's coming out soon, and it's that. So I'm not sure. I guess maybe my advice would be to get something, if you want to go that route of using a variety of different things, it's still worth getting something that's high quality, because you still want the best signal going in to the DAW. If you have a bad signal going into a DAW that's not very clear, there's not much, you can only colour it from there. You can't make it better and clearer.
Yeah.
So if that's the route you want to go, I'd recommend getting a nice quality one, but something that's quite clean. So like a Neve one, for example, is great, but it's fairly coloured, and which is a nice, that's what I would go for. But that's the choice I've made. I've decided to sound like that, or I have a couple of valve ones that I really like. So that's the choice I would make there. But if you went for something like a Grace Designs or a Millennia or something, they're companies that are known for making gear that's really high quality and really clean. And then from there in, you can then change it however you like, and that change will have the effect that you're looking for, because you've got a full clean signal going in. So I think there's always an argument for having the best quality signal as far along the chain as you can get it. It's like, there's a friend of mine used to describe, he says his woodwork teacher used to say, keep your wood as long as you can for as long as you can. Meaning once you start chopping bits off, you can't put them back together again. So once you start degrading your signal, you can't make it posher again. So it's best just to keep it as clean and posh as you can for as long as possible until you want to start making decisions about it not being there.
Yeah, I really like that analogy, and it makes perfect sense. And it kind of falls, or it pairs nicely with the idea of getting it right at source when you're recording. So getting it right at source before right at that beginning there, because as you say there, if it's not there to begin with, putting it in or adding it can be tricky, if not impossible.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, brilliant answers to those, Dom, and I hope that's for those three listening and the audience as well has answered those questions. I'm sure it has. So the final bit really is touching on the mix consultancy, because I think it could be a fantastic thing for a lot of our listeners. Now, I came across the mix consultancy because I interviewed a producer called 1=2, Brandon Ganch, a few months ago, and he mentioned that he used your service.
He has.
On his album Dead Pixels.
Did a few things on that record. It's good. It was a good example actually of he did a few tracks. We worked on a few tracks together, and he got better and better as they went along. So it was good.
Yeah. He mentioned it, and he sort of signposted me in your direction. So, audience listening, if you want to go and check out that particular episode, is episode 35. Do so after listening to this one, obviously. But that's episode 35 with 1=2. So I know you touched on it briefly earlier, but can you just give us a really quick sort of breakdown of the mixed consultancy? Because I know there's also tutorial elements and courses involved in it as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, kind of. Well, there are some of those. So basically, the idea is, it's a bit like I explained earlier. I managed to get my head over another engineer once who had 20 years experience with me, saw what he did to my mixes, and I learned a ton in that period. So I thought, how can I make that available to people that can't afford, for time or money reasons, full-time education in music production? So I thought, well, I can do that. I can offer people that. So you upload your mix to me, and then there were two sort of packages. There's gold or platinum, and gold is I listen to it, I write down all the things that I would change at that point, and then I send you a PDF with all of those things. If you buy the platinum one, you then make the changes, do whatever you like to the mix, send it back to me. I check it from there, and I write another list of the things that I would change from here. Send that to you. Then you make the changes, send it back to me, and then I do a third round of. Normally they get smaller as they move along, because we're closing in on stuff. But things do change as you develop the mix through the changes that I've suggested. So then you get a third round where do your PDF of that. So that's gold and platinum packages of that. The reason why there's a course that I have available. I made a course on how to record vocals. And the reason why I did that is a lot of the problems that I hear are actually from people not having recorded the vocal very well. And their mix problems would be mostly or largely easier or gone if they had a really good sounding vocal that was really well performed. So in the recording vocals course, which you can get to on the website, Mix Consultancy, I get into the psychology of it, like how to do pre-production, what to talk about, how to talk about things, tempo, lyrics, pitch, all of the things you need to do and know before you start recording. We talk a little bit about gear, I talk about how to run the process of recording and what to do about editing, tuning, all that stuff afterwards. So you can just get a great lead vocal and then you can, mixing's just so much easier if you've got a great lead vocal to work for. So that's kind of what I've got with the Mix Consultancy. It's mostly about those kind of the consoles. That's why I started it. But then I've got that course there because I know that that's a big part of what would help people get better at mixing as well.
Fantastic. And going back to what you said there about the vocal, I suppose it sort of echoes what we mentioned just then about getting it right at source. And if you go through that process of learning and education and figuring out, actually, if I get this vocal how it should sound before it goes in, like you say, it's going to make it so much easier further down the line.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people don't realise how much performance makes a difference to mixing. If the performance is great, the mix is easier.
Oh yeah,
and
100%.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, which is why I get into the psychology a lot, because the psychology of the session and you as a producer and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've sort of been more so on the other side of the glass, being the musician being recorded, and the reason why that I then looked at production and mix engineering and whatnot is because I kind of poked my head around the door and I looked at the computer and I thought, actually, that's quite interesting, and I kind of want to know what he's doing there at that desk. Yeah. And that's sort of how I sort of came into it.
The thing I find mad as well, the thing I find mad with it is I put a lot into it. And, when I do a vocal session, I'm thinking about lighting and, all this sort of stuff. And then there's people that record themselves and go, oh, well, I won't bother with that stuff. I just, I have a cup of tea and then I start singing. Like, why do I put more effort into someone's vocal session than they put into their own? Why would you not put that effort into your own vocal? It's your vocal. Yeah. Like, it matters more to you. Your name's on everything. Yeah. My name's on it, but your name's bigger, in bigger font than my name is. But I'll put more effort than you would. So I just find that mad. Like, here's all the things you can do that I do to make something better psychologically. Do it to yourself. Like, learn that and treat yourself in a way that means you will get the best performance. Yeah, it's blows me away that occasion when people just go, oh, I don't need to do that. It's like, no, you don't need to. But you'll be better if you do.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that because I've fallen foul of that myself. When I was recording an album many years ago, and when I go into the studio, I tune my guitar, I look at the intonation, make sure the truss rod was set all right, the Floyd Rose was all good, make sure I had decent picks and everything, all my cables were correct, I had everything I needed. But then when I'm sat at home recording, I'm just like, I'll just pick my guitar off the wall and I'll start playing and record it. And I don't know. Yeah, it's exactly that. And maybe I don't know, it's a convenience thing. You're sort of like, it's that relaxed atmosphere. You sort of need to take yourself away to another room. Or it's like you say, it's the psychology of it, isn't it? It's totally the psychology. When you go into that studio.
You perform better, I think, when you set yourself up to know that your instrument's bang on, everything's ready to go, you've got the lights dimmed, your phone's off, you know you're ready to record at that point. And I think But I think a lot of people put a bit too much. I mean, this might sound a bit weird, but a lot of people put a bit too much emphasis on having a relaxed performance. Sometimes it doesn't want to be relaxed. Sometimes it wants to be present, and it wants to be urgent, and it wants to be, all 100% in the moment, as opposed to, leaning back on your chair, going, "Oh, that'll do. I got it."
Yeah, I agree with that. I totally agree. And having played metal, it was very much. I mean, we couldn't sit back and relax and play. It was all very a lot of that. So
lean forward. Yeah,
and try and stay in time. That was always my. That's why I think that's why I kind of moved the other way, because I was like, I'm not as good as the other guitarist, so I'm going to start honing my skills somewhere else.
Right. Yeah.
But no, Dom, thank you very much. We sort of reached the hour mark now, and this has been fantastic. Okay. And I know the audience listening is it's going to take so much away from this, as I have done as well. So a really big thank you for spending the time with me today, this Friday evening. Yeah. It's very, very it's fantastic to get your knowledge and spread your knowledge for our audience. So a big thank you, and I'll catch up with you soon, Dom.
Yeah. Cheers.